IT wasn't bad, the IT man is something else. There's a whole series on Channel 4 about him. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you everyone for coming. Very good evening to you all. My name is Sajid and I'm a volunteer for HIMMAH, and we're hosting our guests this evening at the University of Nottingham. I just want to say a few words about HIMMAH and what we do. We're a social justice group that was formed about 4 years ago by a collective of activists and educationalists that were really interested in change for the city. We were people who have grown up in this city, who love it greatly, and we wanted to see an equal opportunity and fairness for everyone and the best opportunities for everyone in the city, regardless of race, gender, creed, or anything else. So we came together and we've been tackling issues now around poverty, race and educational inequalities in the city. And we do this through various means. One of them is through our direct services. So in poverty, we have a house where we house 2 destitute families. We run a food bank. In terms of racial issues, we've recently commissioned a report with Professor Wright at this HIMMAH Institute at the University of Nottingham, looking at stop and search and police retention of the BME community and the experience of crime. In terms of education, we're piloting a supplementary school, improving English and maths, and just launching an Arabic academy. And there's a lot more to come, and that's not the start of it. But one of our key issues in our city is leadership, and the issue of maybe my guests and or maybe they will disagree with me, is the crisis of leadership within communities at the moment. So we're really, really happy that we've managed to get everyone in one place at the right time, I think. Well, they're here. So the chair is someone who we're incredibly grateful for, who's always been our volunteers and who's always given HIMMAH great support and great wisdom from behind the scenes, and it's the second time he's chairing one of our events for me. It's our very own, our dear beloved, Dr. Ahmed Meliebary, who I don't think, who I believe, he keeps insisting that we call him Ahmed, but I'm said at the place that pays him to be called a doctor, we have to call him doctor at the university. So he, as many of you know, is a lecturer at the language school here, and his forte has been Arabic. Which has always been incredibly difficult for me, so I won't pretend to talk about the subject at all. So at no further means, I'll hand over to your good self, sir.
Jazakumullah khair. Right. I tried preparing a very brief introduction, and I found difficulty because when you read about someone who has done so much in so much short a time, I think you just feel perplexed and honored to meet in person. I mean, it's an honor tonight to introduce you, Dr. Laura McDonald. It's going to be more than a deal of a Big Mac tonight, right? Yes, tackling an issue that has 3 main facets, starting with the F word. Are you familiar with the F word? Right? Now, it's quite an interesting topic, at the least to say, by someone who's done interesting research into social anthropology combined with Arabic and Middle Eastern studies at the University of St. Andrews, and then moved forward to do a PhD at Women's Center of York University. Now, I don't want to, spend more time because I am as eager as you are. Quite a good group. I see familiar faces, and I see faces that I would like to get acquainted to even more, and carry out, projects like these together, and continue with the discussion and the communication. I'm not going to say any more other than, Laura continues to teach, in those areas and a bit more. And she's going to enlighten us today. So I'll just leave the floor to Laura to come over, and I'll help you with that.
Thank you.
Please.
This one?
I think it's best, isn't it?
This one?
So should I, and this one as well?
Yeah.
All right.
So, is that okay?
Ready to go.
Okay, I'm not deafening anyone at the back? No? Okay, thank you. Okay, good evening and Assalamu alaikum, and really thank you for inviting me and a very too kind introduction. I have been asked to talk about women and activism and leadership, and really this is in the context of HIMMAH's amazing work in Nottingham, and in fact all of your amazing work in Nottingham, which I've been learning about today. And it's a subject that I love and have, I suppose, spent a long time thinking about and talking about, so I don't want to take up the entire evening or indeed entire weekend. So I thought what I'd do was kind of address some of the challenges and start with I guess, the depressing stuff, and then move on to the positive things that we have at our disposal within the Islamic framework and in terms of activism and the way that community grassroots organisations such as HIMMAH are doing such important work. And then I think we'll hear from Farzana afterwards. So I will bring up the PowerPoint presentation, which has turned out okay. Slideshow.
It's at the bottom.
Can I do it from there? No, like this? Yes, that's okay. Okay. And we've got about, I'm just looking for Farouk, about 20 minutes, half an hour? I'll watch the faces to glaze and then measure it. And I thought we could open it out because I'm not sure you know what particular interests you have as well, so we can open it out to discussion and hear from Farzana as well. So women, leadership and activism. With thanks to HIMMAH. And I think the kind doctor here was also mentioning this F word, and I think that's often one of the first barriers to talking about the subject of women in particular, because people are like, well, what's the problem? They either don't want to talk about feminism and gender issues and gender justice because it's seen as a controversial issue, or one in which that pits genders against each other, that it's somehow about women against men, or very reactionary ways of being and thinking. Or, well, you know, we're in the 21st century, why do we even need to talk about this? There's equality, isn't there? But of course, for most of us, we know this isn't true. I mean, from a very basic economic level, even in the UK, gender equality is an issue, to our various social and cultural practices in different contexts over time and place over the world. So really, I wanted to talk about understanding challenges, and actually not necessarily talk about all the challenges there are, because we'd be here for the next 5 years, but talk about some of the barriers to understanding challenges, and in particular the challenges in the UK context. And I'll be talking specifically about Muslim communities, but actually there's a lot of connections and issues that aren't just Muslim specific, but actually are around these issues of justice and making change at the grassroots. Because there's one thing from an academic perspective, people talking about theory and talking about those kind of debates in that kind of ivory tower setting. There's another thing actually changing things on the ground, and that's something I'm interested in. So I'll talk a little bit about feminism and Islam as well, which is a controversial topic in itself in terms of the way that people perceive Islam, how people perceive feminism, and where sometimes there's a conversation happening, not just, as I say, from the theoretical perspective, but in terms of actual practical action and changing things and making the world better in our sort of our, not just about ideals, but achieving the justice that we see fit. And of course, the inspiration and leadership, the kind of things that are actually going on, that Farzana, I think, is going to enlighten us on further. So starting with the challenges. We talk about violence against women, and I think this is something that I come across often is perhaps an underestimation of the kind of levels of different kinds of violence that we have within all of our communities, within all societies, particularly against women. And there's power dynamics, and feminists would describe this as patriarchy and power interrelations between gender, but we've also got class and racial dynamics and the kind of inequalities that we all understand and know about, creating systems of violence that impact particularly on women, although children obviously as well. And there's this kind of feeling from people such as Ban Ki-moon, as quoted here, the United Nations, this situation where the statistics are looking fairly grim. And globally, of course, 1 in 3 women experiencing some form of domestic violence, which they include as physical, sexual, emotional, social or economic. Economic being, for example, withdrawing finance from within the home or those kind of issues. So this is a real, when people say, oh, well, why are we talking about gender? Why are we talking about the issues of women? Then these are the reality for many people is something, there's a violence and there's attitudes that underpin that violence that, you know, we need to talk about more openly, I think, and that's across society. When we have people like Miley Cyrus talking about feminism, when we have femen who feel they need to talk about Muslim women in particular and feminism within that context in the manner that they do, we have, you know, a conversation to be had that is beyond statistics and that's beyond talking about this battle between cultures or feminism. So I think in this context, one of the most important things to think about is the way that women's rights has been politicised. And I'm based in Birmingham. And recently, over the past year, we've had Malala Yousafzai coming to live in the city. And I thought she's a very good example of a number of issues. First of all, of course, the situation with regards to attitudes towards female education in the Pakistan-Afghani border. But actually, not only that, where, you know, a young girl, for speaking her mind about women's education, can get shot in the head by an adult man. I mean, this is the crux of the issue. But also the politicisation of that act. And what I thought was interesting and brings us into this conversation is that suddenly Malala herself was being seen as a pawn of the West versus the Muslims, or these kind of conversations started happening very quickly. And, you know, I'm involved in activism within Birmingham, and I you know, have networks of conversations, if you like, and this was not an uncommon sentiment, and it remains as she gets more exposure and her book has been published, this kind of tension between saying, yes, there is a serious problem, and you know, we're talking about such a basic, simple thing about girls going to school. I mean, where is the controversy in that? And the violence brought into that, but also this political idea that somehow it's the West versus Islam, or the appropriation of her voice for Western propaganda needs. And then the conversation begins to become politicised, and the point in the first place gets lost. We're no longer talking about young women's education, we're talking about American foreign policy, we're talking about drones, these kind of things. So very quickly, women's rights are politicised, and this isn't only in the Muslim context, but I think the contemporary Muslim context, and in fact a lot of history, has created the situation where Muslim women are at the centre of so many kind of political discourses which are actually extremely damaging to the cause of equality and gender justice for Muslims and for women more generally. So we see the exploitation and violence across time and space, and this isn't about particular groups or particular communities, but what's interesting is this intersection of Muslim and Islamic contexts. And I'll talk a little bit first about the kind of outside the Islamic framework and the kind of barriers that we have there, and then I'll talk briefly about the internal conversations. I don't want to go too much into theology, although I'm not a theologian. I do like to question and bring and raise the questions about the different kinds of interpretations and the kind of conversations internally we have as from an Islamic perspective, but we probably don't necessarily want to spend too long on that, but we can always open that to discussion. But really I wanted to point out this politicisation of women's rights and freedoms, not only happening now in the kind of post 9/11 war on terror kind of context, but also that history of Orientalism and imperialism and colonialism, which itself politicised Muslim women's bodies and also Western women's bodies in very different ways. And just to highlight that this is nothing new, this has been going on. Women tend to be the symbols and the locations. We talk about women's honour and women as cultural vessels. We have the symbols, if you think of Queen Boudica and the English rose, we have ideas that nations are represented by women, our communities are somehow represented by women, and the battleground, if you like, happens around women and around women's bodies. And I think I'll go to this slide first. because it leads on nicely about this idea of conquest and the politicization of women and women's rights around this notion of violence and war. So I use these pictures because I think they're arresting and important pictures, but also I do so also saying that I'm aware that perhaps we are recreating the violence that is within these pictures. So there's a tension there. But I'll tell you what they're about. This is a picture by Marc Goranger, and there's a whole kind of host of photographs. I don't know if any of you are familiar. He was in the French colonial army in Algeria, and his role as a soldier was to take photographs of the war and document the war. And this particular set of photographs is of Algerian women in what was known as the Battle of the Veil, where the literal battleground of the imperial struggle to maintain control of Algeria happened almost literally on women's bodies. So there was an idea that women were transporting weapons for the resistance, the Algerian resistance, under their haiks, under their coverings. And there was also this idea that if they civilized the Algerians and they made them French and they made them European and they took away this barbaric religion of Islam, if they could change the cultural ways that Muslim women were expected and did, they could somehow, achieve the colonial dream of total domination. So they went from village to village, and they ordered women to literally line up against the walls and to remove their outer coverings. And then they took pictures. They shot them in the photographic sense. And there's a whole host of these pictures of women, and I think you can see it on her face of resistance and hatred and shock and distress. Really quite horrific pictures. But what's interesting is that this is a sort of epistemic violence, a symbolic kind of violence, but it's very intimately linked with this idea of civilizing and of promoting women's rights in the name of a political game. I think we see this as well. I use this construction of the Afghan woman, and not to detract from the struggles that Afghan women continue with today, but the use of women by politicians such as George Bush, who famously said he was invading Afghanistan after 9/11 to liberate the Afghan woman. And we had Oprah Winfrey having an Afghan guest, and she threw off her burqa and she was wearing, a kind of stereotype of Western clothes underneath. And it was almost like this symbolic removal of her Islamic shackle into the Western freedom. So again, very, very symbolic. And just to go back to some more, what happens to be French colonial pictures, again, they were big on their pictures, but this kind of dehumanizing of Muslims generally and of the other, of anyone who was not white and middle class. And they did this about the working class, and I think we can still see those discourses happening even today. The discourse of chavs in the UK at the moment about the working class or the underclass people who are, inferior. Of course, these kind of discourses, and Edward Said has always talked about this, but this kind of picture where a woman with her face covered exotically, as they saw, was both barbaric and exotic and attractive and repulsive, but with her breasts laid bare. I've covered her up, but essentially she's bare-breasted with the burqa on. And again, what is that saying? That's about, look at these uncivilized people. Look at the way the women are there. They're both covered and revealed. They're both exotic and desirable. All these kind of discourses, which I think we can actually see in contemporary discourses as well. There's very little changed. We've seen the Kenza Drida, for example, who fought to, wear her niqab in the French context. And assert her right to choose what she wears, for example. Or recent in Birmingham, we've had a college that decided to tell its Muslim students what to wear and what not to wear. And again, it's about choice and agency, which becomes politicized. So this concept of Muslim women becomes, or of gender per se, becomes marked by stereotypes and discourse and narratives which really rarely reflect the actual reality of women, the diversity and the individuality of us all as people, as humans. And this is not only from the outside, but also from within communities, which is, I guess, is a natural phenomenon of human beings to try and push these kind of labels and these ideals. But that we have these constructions of Muslim womanhood, which can go from anywhere from the kind of the stereotype of the oppressed and silent and exploited to current ideas of the fanatic, bolstering jihad and going around ruining British cultural values and all of those kind of conversations that we can look in the Daily Mail on a daily basis and other such publications. But also we have these kind of ideals within the Muslim community and within all faith communities, where this idea, this is an Iranian I think state-sponsored kind of mural where they're talking about how the perfect woman is like a pearl in her shell, and she's devout and pious and sort of floating around in an almost angelic aura of Muslim womanhood. And again, to what extent does this reflect people, human beings, as communities, but also as individuals? So we have to get over this barrier of stereotype, which can sometimes be very positive, but actually restrict and simplify these very complex and difficult issues. And then, of course, the contemporary Islamophobic situation, where again the Muslim woman's body is used and stereotypes are used. So the EDL is keen, and it even has something called the Angel's Wing. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but the Angel's Wing, which in itself I find quite an interesting construction, but it's their female wing. And their job is to come and save Muslim women. And so there's this kind of idea that this sort of moral panic that Sharia law is going to be on our streets and there's going to be all sorts of horrific things happens. The Muslim woman is used in this way to support what's essentially a fascist ideology, or underpinning a fascist ideology. And again, issues around grooming and the current hysteria and focus on Muslim men and their activities, and the actual ignoring of other groups, both as victims and as perpetrators, where the kind of this is kind of Muslified and seen as a Muslim issue and a Muslim problem, to promote this idea of fear of Muslims and Islamophobia. The problem is that this kind of behaviour obviously doesn't help women, who perhaps in some cases and in some contexts do require support and agency. And similarly, this is not helping the issue around grooming and exploitation. So there's a whole load of barriers that we could talk about all night, but I'm aware already of the time. So I thought it's interesting, as well as these kind of barriers that we need to get over in order to have the conversation that women are diverse and have different contexts, and therefore the needs or not depend, and we need to understand from that perspective. We also have like the kind of tools, how can we make change? And there's first that kind of mental framework, that shift that we need to understand. And sometimes when we talk about feminism, as I said, traditionally from the Western perspective, it was the feminist movement which was born in order to address issues of gender inequality in the Western context. And I think a lot of the time we have particularly strong stereotypes even of feminism, so the radical kind of 70s feminist of bra burning and of man hating and of a kind of image of radical feminism, which has itself almost become a parody of itself. And even now, within the Western context, people are very uncomfortable with the F word. People will not talk about being feminists, and they're very uncomfortable with it. So there's an issue with feminism in the popular imagination anyway. But the relationship between feminism and Islam itself has a complicated history and a complicated continuum. But what's interesting is that actually we're seeing a kind of use of feminism as a tool within some Muslim contexts in different ways. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that and open up some of those challenges and complexities, as well as the positive elements. So I've quoted Fatima Mernissi here, who I suppose is has been seen as the grandmother of Muslim feminism. in the traditional Western second wave tradition. And in some of her, particularly her earlier texts, she's extremely vocal. And this is a typical quote, that the Muslim woman is that submissive, marginal creature who buries herself and only goes out into the world timidly and huddled in her veils, a mutilated companion for the Muslim man. So that's not a particularly friendly kind of conversation between the Islamic tradition and the feminist tradition, and that's coming from someone from a Muslim background who was brought up in Morocco and came to this notion of feminism and really felt that she needed to struggle against things that she'd seen in her own life, her own experiences and the experiences of those around her, that led to this kind of what I would say is quite a hostile understanding of Islam and Muslim contexts. So in a way we have the barrier when we're talking about changing things on the ground and feminism being this tradition that's grown from the West, of Western stereotypes about Islam and Muslims, this idea that there's a clash, that the two are completely incompatible because, hey, Islam is a patriarchal and woman-hating religion that insists on particular modes of dress and particular modes of behaviour for women and is therefore completely incompatible. And therefore a Muslim feminist is coming from that framework and can only therefore really have a conversation about reforming Islam or taking parts of Islam or the abrogation of certain parts of Islam in order to make it fit, if you like, into this particular understanding of feminism and particularly from a Western perspective. And then there's debates around, even what we mean about equality. Are we talking about equal means men are the same as women? Or are we talking about some sort of gender complementarity? There's those kind of debates which we can talk about in the discussion if we want to. But also sometimes a complete misunderstanding of the diverse histories and cultural practices and norms in different societies and how this may or may not be a problem, a particular cultural understanding may or may not be a problem for particular women. So feminism has its own history and diversity, and what's interesting is that it's the African-American tradition, the black feminists who have said, well, actually, feminism has this history of tackling things, of activism, of trying to change the way people understand the norms around them, of critiquing and critically engaging. So feminist academics have critically engaged with a whole load of different kind of subjects, and that has been their tradition, and indeed has changed the attitudes of people very effectively. But on the flip side, there has been a tendency for it to be Eurocentric, middle class, extremely white, something that is disconnected from communities and therefore is irrelevant. And actually that conversation within feminism has happened and room has been made so that black feminists began to say, well, actually, there's racism within feminism and feminism itself can be a tool but not a movement. And even this whole idea of sisterhood, well, are we all sisters? Are we all equal? Are we all having the same experiences? Do we all have the same needs? Well, of course not. So even questioning that whole notion that somehow there's a blanket experience for women, which is based really on the experience of a particular class and particular ethnicity and cultural position. So these conversations have happened, and in a way, interestingly, the notion of Islamic feminism, i.e. feminism within the Islamic framework, has started to come up. So there's almost a tension around even what we mean by Islamic feminism or Muslim feminism. And that goes a little bit around the whole notion of Islamic teachings and ideals and interpretations. And I suppose what I'm saying by all of this, before I start going off on the whole thing about Islamic feminism, is that these are the tools necessary to perhaps shift people's understanding, perhaps shift and question those underlying norms that can be things that support, various forms of repression or various forms of inequality and injustice. So that we have debates happening within I suppose Muslim academics circles, but also amongst Muslim scholars about particular interpretations. What do we mean about this particular ruling? Parts of fiqh, for example, where there's room for difference and how particular elements of the fiqh can be applied, that is, of Muslim jurisprudence. can be applied in different ways and how that might affect. So, for example, on the subject of female genital mutilation, internal conversations about particular religious rulings, particular religious perspectives, and how they may or may not support change on the ground. Early marriage in Yemen, for example, those kind of conversations from a scholarly perspective, you know, not necessarily being defined as feminists, but actually the tools of feminism, that kind of engagement, the idea of opening up a space to discuss things, having that feminist flavour. So although some people may be having those conversations and not identify as feminist, the kind of traditions and tools we can see to a certain extent is this idea of an Islamic feminism, i.e. a quest for gender justice within the Islamic framework, depending on how we understand that framework. So really, this notion of leadership and of activism being underpinned by those things that we take for granted, our social, political and religious understandings. And I'm interested in this idea of religious understandings as well as social, but the way that the power of religion, the power of scholarship and the role that our ulama, of our religious scholars have in our communities is something very exciting, but also conversely can be problematic. So we have those conversations, you know, figures such as Amina Wadud, who are very controversial and open out conversations, for example, about women leading prayer. Perhaps they're the people at the margins that push and the centre moves. So, okay, we might be, you know, she might be a controversial figure, but she opens out conversations about other things and internal conversations about, okay, maybe we don't need to reinterpret our holy texts in such radical ways. Some people would believe we do, but maybe it's about reclaiming the traditions and the kind of understandings of religion that have happened traditionally, but have perhaps been deleted or forgotten or twisted for political reasons, for you know, the power dynamics that we have in our, you know, in our leadership, all the way down to our family relations and our individual relations. So this is important, this revival, the reclaiming, the reframing and the reasserting of different kinds of ideas, and really having that healthy conversation. And I think that's happening, and it's happening more and more. And the more that we have people learning from religious but also academic, sort of traditional academic subjects, and having those conversations, it becomes very interesting conversation where people are confident about their own knowledge. They're not having to rely on hearsay or superstition or the traditions of a family or a community, but are going back and examining religious frameworks and are saying, you know, this is my understanding of the deen, you know, how can this inspire me as a Muslim or as a person? And this isn't necessarily just in the Islamic framework, but this is happening all over. But, you know, as individuals, we have agency and potential authority to change things within our locality, but also to open out these discussions. So, of course, we have historical and contemporary inspiration, and it's about women's participation, and women's participation itself leads to this idea of authority and leadership and activism and making changes, because without participation and the kind of the need to shift particular attitudes, whatever framework we're taking, then leads on to this ability for women to lead. And just before I get onto the kind of historical inspiration, which I think, you know, the Islamic traditions are so strong with, it's interesting. I was talking to an alima from the Deobandi tradition, and she has trained within the traditional scholarly madrasa system there, and has got her qualifications. And this is someone who is very devoted to her particular sheikh and her particular madhab and her particular manhaj, if you like. But what was interesting about what she was saying is the difference in the curriculum for women learning within that system than it is for men. So one would assume that everyone would have the same curriculum and learn, but actually the women's curriculum is much less and tends to focus around women's issues. So it's not just about an equality issue, but it's about an authority issue, because what you end up with is women scholars who are less qualified than male scholars, and therefore the authority of the women themselves as people of religious standing or communal standing is then naturally going to be less than the men, because they have less confidence, less knowledge, and less understanding of particular issues, because the actual process of learning and the system of learning has been gendered in that way. So again, it's about challenging within, not necessarily rejecting, but trying to say, well, you know, why is this, and this has, what kind of what's happening here, and how can we change it? Not in necessarily a radical break down all the barriers kind of way, but in a way that brings people together, and you know, people can stay within their traditions but be critical, and I think that's an important and interesting development there. But of course, we've got the inspiration. I can see time's going too quick. But for example, the historical, and this was always something that inspired me, people talk about this kind of stereotype of Islam and Muslims, but when we look into our history, and particularly for people not familiar with this history, it's always surprising. I mean, many of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ were amazing, strong women in their own rights in different fields. So of course, Khadija bint Khuwaylid, as a businesswoman, as a powerful operator, as someone in her own right and standing, you know, how many, well actually in contemporary times we do have amazing businesswomen, but this is a way of asserting, yes, this is a possibility. This isn't just a Western innovation. This is something that was there from the beginning. Aisha bint Abu Bakr, who of course was a wife, but also an amazing scholar. Much of our deen has been passed through her lips. The kind of Islamophobic discourse focusing on her age and those kind of things actually take away her incredible standing and as a scholar and a political heavyweight. The kind of controversies we have and divisions within between Sunnis and Shia to an extent are focused on Aisha because she was such a political person. She was someone who engaged in politics, and therefore we have this kind of this example of someone who was engaged in many, you know, as a leader within her community. And then, of course, all the amazing different companions, Umamara, the battlefield warrior, who, you know, defended her own sons and was the, you know, the shield of the Prophet. Zainab bint Ali as a spiritual leader, as someone who stood up to the power of the day and resisted. And then those who weren't companions and came much later, but we've got amazing examples, someone like Queen Amina of Zaria, which is, I believe, in now modern Nigeria, who wasn't just a ruler of that area, but someone who brought learning to her people, and particularly to women. She made sure that the traditional texts, the Islamic texts, were taught in villages and that women were memorizing them and women were passing them down. So even today we have a tradition in that area of knowledge within, at the grassroots level, amongst women. So a real impact there. And of course the Changemakers now, and that's where I think Farzana is going to talk about leadership and actually how we make change in our own communities here. Never mind just the shifting of our eyes and the shifting of the framework, but actually going out there. So using this power of Islam and faith-based approaches, or indeed non-faith-based approaches that are compatible and that people feel comfortable with. And there's always a spectrum around that, with this inspiration of history and the contemporary leadership. So we do have all sorts of different kind of Muslim feminist kind of voices, but we have also, you know, those who maybe not coming from that perspective, but are absolutely fighting for particular changes. And our local leader, Salma Yaqub, I included her because she's a local to Birmingham, but, you know, she's a voice who is engaging with, you know, mainstream media. She talks, she challenges Islamophobia, she's out there. Even someone like Baroness Varsi, for example, not necessarily, you know, hugely popular necessarily amongst some members of the communities, but she's out there, she's talking about things and she's engaging, and I think that's where the change and the leadership comes from. And we've got an amazing kind of grassroots activism that's happening and we can draw upon. And really just to say that, you know, it's about all of us. It's not about, you know, particular skills or particular qualifications, but it's about that passion. And I think that's what HIMMAH is so you're doing such important work, I think, because you are bringing that kind of inspiration and particularly to young people and showing that that can actually happen, you know, it's on our shoulders. So that was just the kind of broad ideas, and I'm sorry I probably took way too long, but if people want to carry on the conversation, I'm really rubbish on Twitter, and it's a company Twitter, but anyway, I'm a bit on that, but by email, and keep in touch, and hopefully we can discuss a little bit afterwards, but I'll hand you over to Farzana, so thank you.
That was amazing. This one. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most kind. Peace and blessings upon our liege Lord Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his companions, one and all. I want to take this opportunity today to speak to you on some of the issues facing our community, as well as women's leadership. And thank you so much. That was really amazing. I've made loads of notes, so I'll definitely be in touch. And I don't do Twitter as well. Right, so I'm like many of you here as a sister, a daughter, a mother, a volunteer, and a leader. And like many women today, we need to define our role in society. Many of you will know me in my professional capacity as a management and leadership trainer. I've been training for just under 20 years, which kind of gives you an idea of my age. And particularly my work with the Nottinghamshire Constabulary and East Midland Police Forces as a leadership management trainer, and also as the Vice Chair of HIMMAH, a social justice group which is working in this city on many issues in the last few years, particularly destitution, poverty, education, and racial inequality. But I'm not here tonight in that capacity. I'm really here in front of you as a sister, following on from the legacy of a female companion who stood up on a Friday sermon, following on really from what Hazrat Umar has said about reducing haq meher for women. And she spoke up with sincere advice and said that no legislator can take away anybody's God-given right. And like Dr. Laura, mentioned all those examples that we have, all those great, Islamic examples we have within the mothers of the believers, Hazrat Khadija, a great, entrepreneur, Hazrat Aisha, an active, active in her Islamic politics, great, strong role model for all of us, a great thinker. But I just want to share with you one of my own experiences with one of those destitute people that we help support. I was invited by Sajid from HIMMAH to experience one of their monthly soup kitchens here in Nottingham. And what I saw there really moved me. I saw over 50 people there who were there from all over the world, like you and myself, who suffered persecution and torture from their country, their own homeland, and who are now destitute here in Nottingham, sleeping rough. And I met a lady who had a daughter as young as mine, who was living off just £7 food bag a week, which she was receiving from this soup kitchen. And this was really, really disturbing. A, that this actually exists, this issue exists, and B, that this exists within the Muslim community and the wider community when there's over 15,000 Muslims here in Nottingham. And we have been mandated by God and his messenger to spread peace and justice. So the life of the messenger of God from start to end is an example of the highest ethics and morals of social justice for all of us. And yet, how do we reconcile all these injustices in our city? This is our homeland, this is our city. And yet we call ourselves Muslims and the follower of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And all of these are the symptoms from an underlying cause. That cause is, I believe, the lack of unity and lack of unity of collective action. And we can only act when we have strong leaders with strong institutions working together and we need to cross the divide and come together on common ground. The issues and symptoms are indictment of our status quo, and we need to change.